Picture this. A little red-cheeked girl named Mary is born in Greenwich on a cold February day in the year 1516. And inside the palace, everyone finally exhales. Because after years of miscarriages, King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon at last have living proof that their marriage can produce a child. She is not the son Henry wanted, but for a while that does not matter. He calls her his pearl, shows her off to ambassadors, and Catherine, the iron-willed Spanish princess raised between battlefields and incense-thick churches, pours into her daughter everything she believes in, teaching her Latin and music and theology, teaching her that Rome is the heart of the true faith and that a royal woman must be educated, devout and unbreakable. Mary grows up as both cherished daughter and glittering bargaining chip, promised and re-promised to princes she has never seen, certain that her future lies in a great marriage that will bind kingdoms together and that her father's love is a fixed star in the Tudor sky. Beneath the dancing and the lessons, though, something gnaws at Henry that Mary cannot see. His own father won the crown in blood. The Tudor dynasty is young, and every year, without a living son, feels like an invitation for civil war to return. As Catherine moves into her 40s and her womb stays empty, fear curdles into obsession. And into this dangerous moment walks a dark-eyed lady in waiting named Anne Boleyn, who refuses to be a passing mistress and demands a crown instead. To marry Anne, Henry must tear up 20 years of marriage and the rules of his own religion. And while scholars argue over verses from Leviticus and papal diplomats delay, the king convinces himself that his union with Catherine was cursed from the start because she was once his brother's wife. If the marriage was never valid, then Mary is not legitimate. And that single idea drops like a stone through the calm surface of her life, cracking everything beneath. The battle for an annulment drags through Mary's adolescence like a storm that will not move away. And Henry's frustration hardens into cruelty. He forbids Mary to see her mother unless both of them accept the divorce, strips away her title as Princess of Wales, cuts down her household, and finally orders her to serve in the nursery of the baby who has replaced her in his plans. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, born at Greenwich in the year 1533, and hailed as high and mighty princess, while Mary stands nearby dressed like a servant, pressed again and again to sign a paper calling herself a bastard and her parents' marriage incestuous. Yet the wheel that crushes her never stops turning. Catherine of Aragon dies far from court, still calling herself Henry's true wife. And not long after Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Mary lost everything is herself dragged to the Tower of London, accused of adultery, incest and treason, and beheaded in the year 1536. Almost before the echo of the sword stroke fades, Henry is courting Jane Seymour, who will finally give him what he has gambled his soul and his kingdom for. A little boy named Edward, born in the autumn of the year 1537, around whom the entire court begins to spin. For a while, both Mary and Elizabeth are pushed to the edges, officially branded illegitimate on paper, yet quietly written back into the line of succession in their father's last act, so that when Henry dies in January of the year 1547, after 6 wives and a brutal break with Rome, his son is king, but the 2 discarded daughters stand next in line behind him, like shadows he could never quite erase. Under Edward VI, real power lies with hard line. Protestant councillors who see the boy as their chance to remake England. New English prayer books replace Latin. The old religion is driven out of the churches. And Mary, now a grown woman with a spine of steel, becomes the most famous Catholic in the land, insisting on hearing Mass in her own household and clashing with her teenage brother in scenes so heated that both end in tears. As Edward's health fails in the year 1553, He looks ahead and sees Mary's crown as the death sentence of his Protestant project. And so with his council he drafts a secret device for the succession that pushes both sisters aside in favour of a pale, pious cousine named Lady Jane Grey, married conveniently into the family of the most powerful lord at court. This is the moment when Mary, written off for so long as a sickly, defeated woman, suddenly becomes terrifyingly effective, warned that she is about to be seized. She rides hard to her estates in East Anglia, calls on tenants and nobles who still honour Catherine of Aragon's memory, and raises an army under banners that proclaim her the rightful daughter of Henry VIII. While in London, the Duke of Northumberland proclaims Jane Queen and tries to lock the capital down. When Jane is announced to the people, there is an eerie silence, and as word of Edward's death spreads, gentry and commoners alike begin to drift toward Mary's camp, not out of burning Catholic zeal, but because they know her face and her blood. Within days, the coup collapses. Without the civil war, everyone feared. Northumberland kneels to Mary. Jane's 9 days, as Queen end in the Tower, and Mary rides into London in royal purple and heavy jewels. The first crowned Queen Regnant of England, with Elizabeth riding behind her in green and white Tudor colours. The sisters smiling for the crowds while old wounds and future dangers simmer like coals under ash. From that entry, the story will only grow darker and more tangled, as Mary tries to turn the clock back by reconciling England with Rome, marrying Philip of Spain and lighting the stakes that will earn her the name Bloody Mary in later memory, while Elizabeth tiptoes through plots and rebellions, imprisoned in the same tower rooms where her mother waited for death, and surviving only because Mary's hand shakes over a death warrant she cannot quite bring herself to sign. A swollen stomach that many believe is a miracle pregnancy will turn out to be a phantom, and when there is no baby, and Philip sails away, her dream of a Catholic heir dies in public before the eyes of a court that has already started to glance toward Hatfield, where Elizabeth waits like a patient, hungry star. When Mary dies in the year 1558, worn down by sickness, grief, and disappointment, Elizabeth steps into the space her sister fought to open, rules for decades, and spins herself into Gloriana, the untouchable Virgin Queen. Yet even in that golden light, she never fully escapes her sister's shadow, because the legal right of a woman to rule, the painful first experiment in female sovereignty, the hard work of forcing a patriarchal kingdom to accept that a queen can wield a king's power, all of that belongs first to Mary. In the end, they lie side by side in Westminster Abbey, in a shared tomb, two queens bound together by blood, faith and their father's obsessions. And every time we look at a modern queen and feel no surprise, we are walking on ground that these two Tudor sisters stained with tears and fire. A story of love and rivalry and survival that this series will now unfold night after night like a long, dark tapestry. Mary's story does not begin with flames or crowns, but with the quiet discipline of a child who believes the world is simple, ordered, and safe. To a world where her father's smile means God is pleased with her, and her mother's rosary beads mean everything will come right if she just prays hard enough. In the long galleries of Greenwich and Richmond, little Mary trails behind Catherine of Aragon, clutching a book that is too heavy for her wrists, repeating Latin phrases until her tongue aches, because her mother insists that a princess must know more than hymns and dances. She must be sharp enough to argue with theologians and steady enough to ride alongside kings. Mary's days are filled with music lessons, with Spanish songs and English ballads, with tutors drilling her in grammar and philosophy until even her play feels like preparation. And everyone around her treats her like a future empress, a glittering pawn to be slid across the map of Europe into the arms of some French or Habsburg prince. When ambassadors visit, Henry calls her to perform, sets her at the virginals, or urges her to speak in flawless Latin, and she feels his pride wash over her like sunlight, not knowing that beneath his praise is always the same cold fact, that she is a daughter when what he cannot admit he is terrified of not having, is a son. As she moves from nursery to childhood, the negotiations over her tiny hand are constant and dizzying. Old men in embroidered coats, talking calmly about sending her across the sea at 12 or 13, as if they were discussing a parcel of cloth. And each time she hears that she is betrothed to this prince, or that archduke, she imagines his face, his country, his church. Because for Mary, all of life is coloured by faith. Catherine makes sure of it. The Queen kneels for hours on the cold chapel floor, fasting, scourging herself in secret, whispering prayers in Spanish and Latin. And Mary absorbs the rhythm of these devotions so deeply that her own bones feel as if they are made of incense, smoke, and carved wood. It is Catherine who teaches her that the Pope is Christ's vicar, that the Mass is the beating heart of the world, that to doubt Rome is to doubt God. And because Mary loves her mother with a fierce, almost desperate devotion, she takes those truths into herself so completely that there is no room for compromise later, when compromise might have saved her peace. There is nothing in her early years to warn her how fragile this ordered universe really is. She sees only a father who kisses her hands and a mother who blesses her forehead. And she does not yet recognize the way Henry's eyes linger on the baby boys of other men, or the way courtiers exchange worried looks when another of Catherine's pregnancies ends in blood and silence. The first hints that something is wrong slip in like drafts under a door. There is talk of a lady-in-waiting who never leaves the king's side, of a necklace passed from the royal hand to a slender throat, of evenings, when Catherine sits alone while the court whispers around her. Mary hears Anne Boleyn's name long before she ever sees her, hears it in the bitter edge of her mother's voice and in the nervous joking of servants who pretend not to be afraid, because everyone at court knows what it has meant. Over and over, when a king grows tired of a queen and enchanted by a younger face. But Anne is different, because she does not settle for being a shadow who slips in and out of the royal bed and accepts silence in return. Anne wants to be wife and mother and queen. She wants the crown Catherine wears, and the place Mary has grown up believing is hers by right of birth. And she is shrewd enough to realize that the only path to that glittering future is through Mary's displacement. When Mary watches Anne for the first time, perhaps across the length of a great hall, she sees a woman whose dark eyes and quick tongue seem to hold her father like a spell. And though she has been taught humility, something cold and sharp opens up in her chest at the sight. A fear she cannot name yet, that feels like standing on a frozen river and hearing the first crack. The adult quarrels about Leviticus and papal authority reach her only as commands that sting like blows. One day her father is the champion of the Pope, burning heretics and writing books against Luther. The next he is pacing up and down, red-faced and restless, insisting that his marriage to her mother was never valid because she had belonged first to his brother, quoting a verse about a man who lies with his brother's wife and is cursed with childlessness, as if Mary herself is the proof of that curse, rather than a living, breathing person. Catherine refuses to give in, refuses to call herself anything but queen, refuses to call Mary anything but princess, and so father and husband becomes tormentor, refusing them the simplest human comfort of each other's company unless they submit. Letters pass between mother and daughter like smuggled relics, each one kissed and cried over, and Mary learns to write in a hand that never betrays how hard it is to see the ink through her tears, telling her mother that she will obey, that she will be faithful, that she will never sign away the truth, that their marriage is lawful and sacramental. While outside her chamber doors, The atmosphere curdles from respect to hostility day by day. When the order comes that she is to leave her own household and join the nursery of the new baby Elizabeth, Mary is not just demoted, she is deliberately humiliated. The girl who once held court in Wales and was addressed as Your Grace must now take her place at the back of the room, handing swaddling cloths and toys to nurses who gossip about Anne's gowns and Anne's temper and Anne's triumph. Expected to bow and curtsy to the cradle, as if the infant within it had been born from a marriage blessed by God and law. The badges of the Princess of Wales are taken away, her liveried servant dismissed, the royal accounts rewritten to erase her as if she had been a temporary guest in her own life. And every day some clerk or courtier or priest in the king's pay, appears with yet another document for her to sign, in which she must declare herself the king's natural daughter only, the fruit of a forbidden union, and declare that she accepts Anne as true queen and Elizabeth as rightful heir. She refuses, again and again, even as her health falters, even as she falls into bouts of pain and low spirits so dark that her attendants fear she will die. Because to sign would mean betraying not only her mother, but the God she has been told watches every stroke of her pen. All the while she feels her father's absence like a phantom limb. Once he would ride out with her, lift her into the saddle, boast about her musical skill. But in these years of limbo he avoids her. Or when he does see her, his eyes slide away as if looking at her is too sharp. A reminder of the arguments raging in the council and in his own conscience. To Mary, who still remembers his laughter and the way he once lifted her high in his arms, this new coldness is worse than anger, and it sinks into the softest parts of her, teaching her that love can be withdrawn for reasons that have nothing to do with whether she has been good or dutiful. In that vacuum, Catherine's example expands to fill all space. Mary clings even more tightly to the rituals of the old faith, to fasting, to confession, to long, punishing prayers in freezing chapels. Because, if her father's favor can be lost overnight, then only God's approval feels steady, and she begins to measure herself by how much she is willing to endure rather than how happy she is allowed to be. The banning from her mother's deathbed is the wound that never really heals. When word finally comes that Catherine is ill at Kimbolton, that her strength is ebbing, Mary begs to go to her, sends letters that are as much pleas as they are petitions. And we can imagine her pacing in some cold corridor, counting the days, hoping that the king will relent at least in this, that he will permit one last embrace between the two people he has hurt most. The answer is no. Catherine dies with her daughter miles away, and when the queen's body is carried to Peterborough and buried not as a queen, but as a dowager princess, Mary is not in the procession, forbidden even the bitter comfort of walking behind the coffin. The cruelty of that exclusion scorches itself into her memory, and when gossip spreads that Catherine's heart was found blackened in her body, and some whisper poison, Mary does not need to believe the rumor to feel that her father has killed something sacred. The girl who emerges from this decade of separation, demotion and loss, is no longer the laughing child with music in her fingers. She is a woman whose faith has been sharpened into steel and whose trust has been burned away. And she will carry that hardness with her into every decision she makes when at last the crown she was told to forget is offered back to her by a country that suddenly needs her more than she ever imagined. Elizabeth's life begins in a burst of trumpets and hope, but even in the first years, the foundations under her cradle are already rotten, and though she cannot know it yet, every lullaby sung over her is threaded with fear. She arrives in the late summer of the year, 1533 at Greenwich, wrapped in silk, presented to the court as living proof that Anne Boleyn is fertile, and that Henry's gamble in tearing the kingdom away from Rome has not been in vain. The christening is grand, the titles are magnificent, and for a brief, dazzling moment, The little girl with the copper hair is treated as if the future of England rests lightly in her tiny hands. Her mother walks with her head high, wearing the French hood that has become her signature, reveling in the triumph. And Henry parades his new family, as if daring the world to contradict him. Yet beneath the ceremony lies a cruel absence that will shape Elizabeth more deeply than all the jewels in her cradle to get this child. Henry has cast out another wife and daughter, and the court is now split by resentments and grudges that hum in the air like a hive of angry bees. The baby feels none of this consciously, of course, but children are sensitive to currents they cannot name, and in the restless shuffle of servants, in the sudden silences when certain topics are mentioned, in the way some people look at her with adoration and others with something like pity, a pattern begins to form under her skin that will teach her early that love at court is always conditional and that smiles can hide sharpened teeth. In the rooms beyond her nursery, the woman who fought to make her birth possible is already feeling the ground crack. Anne had traded years of flirtation and refusal for a crown. She had promised Henry sons and a fresh start. And instead, this first child is another daughter. For a while she manages to sell the idea that a boy will come next, that Elizabeth is the opening act to a triumphant dynasty. But every month that passes, without another pregnancy, tightens the knot in Henry's chest. Elizabeth's earliest memories, if she had the words to speak them, would be of a household that swings wildly between lavish affection and prickling tension, of a mother who can be radiant with laughter one evening and brittle with anxiety the next, of a father whose visits are like sudden storms, breaking into her world in a blaze of color and sound, and then vanishing again, leaving the adults around her whispering in corners. When a second pregnancy ends in disaster, and rumors of Henry's wandering eye begin to spread, the air in the Queen's apartments turns heavy, and even the nurses and rockers in the nursery speak more softly, as if the wrong word carried through the wrong door might cost them their positions. Or worse. Then, almost overnight, the tone of the entire palace shifts from strained hope to raw panic. Elizabeth is about 2.5, old enough to understand the mood if not the words. When Anne is arrested and taken to the Tower, servants vanish from the nursery, footsteps thud in the corridors, someone cries behind a closed door, and when the child asks for her mother, she is put off with murmurs and busy hands. The catastrophe that follows is told and retold in chronicles and letters. But, for Elizabeth, it begins with a simple fact that shatters her small world. One day, her mother's scent of perfume and spice is in the air, and the next it is gone forever. She does not witness the trial where men twist every gesture and glance into evidence of sin. Nor does she see the scaffold where Anne kneels in a plain gown and forgives the king who has condemned her. Yet the echo of that blade falling on the neck of the woman who gave her life reverberates anyway in the shape of her future. Within days, the royal household is reorganized. The servants who once called her princess switch to lady, as if a single word can erase her from the line of inheritance. And the pretty clothes and fine furnishings that declared her a royal heir are scaled back, her little household shrinking to something that looks much more like exile than majesty. Henry remarries again with alarming speed, this time to gentle Jane Seymour, and the centre of gravity moves away from the small girl at Hatfield or other country houses, leaving Elizabeth to grow in the spaces the king is not looking at. Isolation could have broken her, as it nearly breaks Mary. But instead it becomes a strange kind of liberation. Out of the spotlight, Elizabeth falls into the hands of tutors who are not distracted by the need to flatter a reigning queen and impress a watching court. They have the time and freedom to turn this unexpectedly sidelined child into a prodigy. Languages bloom on her tongue one by one. Latin and Greek, joining French and Italian. And she begins to move through texts that many men at court could not have read with ease. Her mind, unmoored from the certainty of rank, latches onto the one thing no king can strip from her by decree: her ability to think. The trauma of her mother's fate seeps into her bones in another, more subtle way as well. Elizabeth watches as she grows old enough to understand how dangerous it can be for a woman to rely on a man's desire, how quickly passion curdles into contempt once a wife is no longer useful. Anne's story is a ghost story that haunts her, even when no one speaks it aloud. And the girl who will one day refuse every marriage proposal in Europe begins quietly, in childhood, to distrust the bargain of the marriage bed. When Henry takes yet another wife, Catherine Parr, the atmosphere around his younger children softens briefly. Catherine is bookish and pious, but her piety is of the new, reforming kind. She believes in the value of scripture in English and of intelligent debate, and she takes a particular interest in the education of both Elizabeth and her half-brother Edward. Under her care, Elizabeth moves from being a well-taught noble girl to something far more dangerous in a patriarchal kingdom. A young woman comfortable with theological argument, with political theory, with history and rhetoric, capable of slipping between languages and registers like someone changing gowns. Yet even this season of relative calm is threaded with danger, because Catherine's choice of a new husband after Henry's death brings into Elizabeth's life a man who will mark her in a different, more intimate way: Thomas Seymour, the king's brother-in-law and the new husband of his widow, is charming, restless and deeply ambitious, a man who likes to play with fire. Elizabeth, now moving from girlhood into adolescence, is sent to live in Catherine's household, and at first it must seem like a blessing, a place where she can continue her studies, where she can be near someone who understands both her mother's fate and her own precarious position as a royal girl in a court that chews up wives. But Thomas is there, and he begins a series of games that later generations will struggle to name properly, because the language of harassment and grooming is not yet available. Though the harm is the same, he comes into her chamber early, before she is properly dressed, tickles her, cuts her gown to pieces in so-called playful horseplay, all under the thin excuse of rough, paternal affection, and too many people around them laugh or look away. Catherine, at first, joins in the charade, perhaps telling herself that this keeps Thomas's wandering eye away from other, more dangerous targets. But at some point the atmosphere darkens for her too, and the Queen Widow realizes that a line has been crossed. Elizabeth is sent away from the house in a hurry, heartsick and ashamed, aware that she has been at the center of a scandal that could have ruined her, maybe even cost her life, if enemies at court had chosen to spin it as treason. What this episode leaves behind in her is a knowledge that runs parallel to the lessons in Latin and theology, a deep, visceral understanding that her body, her presence, her very existence can be used by ambitious men as a doorway to power, and that she must guard herself with more than just modesty and prayer. By the time Edward sits on the throne and Protestant factions begin to turn the machinery of state toward their own ends, Elizabeth has already learned to keep secrets, to weigh every word before she speaks, to present different faces to different audiences without losing track of which is true. She watches Mary clash with the council over the Mass, sees the older sister stand in open defiance of the government, and somewhere inside her resolves that if she ever finds herself in such a deadly struggle, she will not fight in straight lines, she will twist and dance and play for time. When the boy king's health breaks and the game over the succession begins again, Elizabeth is not the central player in the way Mary is, but she can feel the danger rising like floodwater around both of them. She knows that Protestant radicals see her as a safer bet than Mary, because her upbringing has been full of reformist teaching. Yet she also knows that any prince or counsellor who thinks he can use her as a puppet, will be disappointed. The news that Edward intends to cut both sisters out in favour of Lady Jane Grey is a warning as much as an insult, proof that blood is no shield, when ideology and ambition are riding high. In that moment, Elizabeth's loyalty to Mary becomes more than family feeling or shared suffering. Supporting her half-sister becomes a way of defending the idea that the daughters of Henry VIII cannot simply be written out of history whenever it pleases ambitious men. It is this, Elizabeth, shaped by a childhood of sudden reversals, of vanished mothers and dangerous stepfathers, of intense study and constant observation, who will ride behind Mary into London. When the people cry for their rightful queen, watching everything, saying little, storing up every lesson about power and peril that the world has to offer. Because somewhere in the quietest part of her mind, she already suspects that the crown that nearly killed her mother and nearly broke her sister may one day be set on her own carefully composed head. When Henry VIII finally dies, and the great bulk of his presence is hauled away to be buried with all the pomp that a guilty conscience and a frightened court can arrange, the kingdom wakes up to a strange quiet. Because the man who roared and raged and smashed the old world to pieces has left behind not a battle-hardened prince, but a slight, clever boy named Edward. And suddenly all the sharpened knives in England are being sheathed in velvet gloves and presented as advice to a king who is barely old enough to hold the sword of state without help. In those first months, Mary and Elizabeth are like moons circling a sun that has not yet learned its own gravity. They are brought to court, acknowledged publicly as the king's sisters, dressed in finery for ceremonies. But behind the scenes, every powerful man knows the real game is being played in council chambers and private closets, where the boy's signature is more valuable than his opinion. Edward is raised on a diet of sermons and reformist treatises, surrounded by men who tell him that his sacred task is to finish what his father began, only half-heartedly, to purge England of the old religion, completely and forever. And because he is young and earnest, and believes what he is told, he takes this role with a seriousness that makes him far more dangerous to his Catholic sister than Henry ever was in his changeable moods. Mary, who has spent the last years of her father's life clawing her way back into some kind of favour by signing away what she holds most dear, now finds herself facing an even colder front. Because Edward is not a man torn between lust and conscience and dynasty. He is a boy, king, certain that God has placed him on the throne to defend the new English church against superstition and idolatry. And in his eyes, her mass, her rosaries, her stubborn refusal to enter a Protestant service are not just private acts of piety, but open rebellion against his authority and against God. She maintains her own little island of the old faith inside her household, hearing the Latin Mass, keeping holy days as she learned them at her Spanish mother's knee. And word of this reaches the council again and again like the smell of incense drifting under a locked door. Debates swirl about how far to push her, whether to drag her before the law or treat her as a dangerous but untouchable symbol. Edward, growing into his teens, begins to chafe at what he sees as cowardice, and his letters and journal entries sharpen into the words of a ruler who believes that even family must bow or be broken. There is a winter when the tension between them finally erupts into something raw and unforgettable. A Christmas that should have been filled with music and feasting instead, curdling into a public quarrel that makes courtiers stare at the floor and servants hold their breath. Mary is summoned, once again, to explain herself, to justify why, in a kingdom that now officially prays in English, she insists on clinging to Latin, why she allows priests to say Mass in defiance of the law under her roof. And in the presence of the council and the young king, she refuses to speak in the careful, evasive language that might have kept her safe. She speaks as Catherine's daughter, as a woman whose whole sense of self is knotted around the old church, telling Edward that she cannot deny what she believes without condemning her soul. He fires back, not as the little brother she once cradled, but as a monarch who has been told since childhood that a heretic left alive is a stain on his conscience, insisting that as king he has a duty to enforce true religion even in his own family. And the scene descends into tears, raised voices, accusations and desperate pleas, until the entire festive illusion of harmony is stripped away, and everyone can see what the future holds if Mary ever gains the crown and tries to drag the country back the way she wants it to go. Elizabeth watches all this with the same cool, attentive gaze. She turned on Thomas Seymour's dangerous games, reading the room, the way other people read books, noting who shifts uncomfortably when Mary speaks, who smiles behind their hands when Edward invokes God's wrath, who steps in gently to soothe, who lets the quarrel run, in hopes it will weaken both siblings. She is Protestant in upbringing but cautious in practice, too intelligent to stake everything on a single doctrinal position while the wind is still shifting, and so she plays a subtler game, attending the services the regime insists on, engaging sincerely with the new theology, but avoiding the kind of fiery, uncompromising declarations that pin a person to one side of the battlefield. She is fond of Edward in a way, as much as she can be fond of anyone who also happens to be a potential threat to her survival, and he in turn enjoys her quick mind and shared delight in scripture and languages. But under the surface of their sibling affection runs the cold awareness that if either Mary or Elizabeth inherits the throne, the other's very existence will become a problem. While the boy king's body begins to betray him, his mind only intensifies. Narrowing in on the project of securing the Protestant future he has been taught to see as holy, the regents around him change as factions rise and fall. The Protector Somerset giving way to the sharper, more ruthless Northumberland, and each man in turn whispers in Edward's ear about what must be done to keep Mary. The Catholic threat from undoing everything. Laws are passed that push reform further, tearing out the last roots of the old ritual, replacing stone altars with wooden tables, silencing the Latin chants Mary grew up on. And across the country, there are pockets of quiet resistance and outright rebellion, uprisings that remind everyone of how near to the surface violence always lies when religion and politics are forced together. Edward hears of these events not as a frightened boy, but as a young believer who sees martyrdom as noble and compromise as cowardice, and his resolve hardens when he dies. The crown must not fall to someone who will reverse his work. This is when the idea of Jane begins to crystallize, at first perhaps as a vague name in a family tree, then as a useful tool in a larger design. Lady Jane Grey. His cousin is pious, studious, and firmly Protestant, a girl shaped by tutors who read to her from the same kinds of books that formed Edward himself. And she has the additional advantage, in the minds of men like Northumberland, of being young, untried and bound by newly arranged marriage ties to their own families. If she becomes queen, they believe they will be able to steer the ship of state through her, to keep the reforming project on track while using her authority to cover their own ambitions. The plan that takes shape is ruthless. In its simplicity, both Mary and Elizabeth will be pushed aside, not because they lack blood, but because they lack the right faith, and a new line of succession will be invented in which Jane, that pale, serious girl who has never asked for a crown, becomes the shield against a Catholic restoration. Edward, coughing, losing weight, feeling his strength ebb in a body that once loved sports and showy displays of royal vigour, takes up his pen and writes the device that will try to reach beyond his own grave, scratching out names, altering phrases, moving the crown along a path that centuries of law and custom do not recognize. It is a daring, almost desperate act for someone so young. But he does not see it as defiance of tradition. He sees it as obedience to God. As if by changing the rules on parchment he can ensure that heaven's will is done in England, even when his own lungs have given out. Around his bed the air grows thick with worry and calculation, with unspoken questions about how the country will react if the daughters of Henry VIII, the women whose faces everyone knows, are told they have no claim. And in country houses miles away, Mary and Elizabeth feel the chill without yet knowing the details, sensing that something is being woven around them in rooms to which they are not invited. Mary hears rumours that her brother is sicker than the court admits, and that the council is whispering about her disobedience, her foreign ties, her stubborn insistence on doing things her mother's way. And she does what she has always done when the world turns against her. She turns to her faith, attending Mass more fervently, writing letters that reaffirm her refusal to compromise, reminding anyone who will listen that she is Henry's eldest legitimate child in God's eyes, even if the law books say otherwise. Elizabeth receives subtler messages, hints that her name may be used or erased, depending on how neatly she can fit into other people's plans. And she responds with studied vagueness, offering loyalty to the king without signing herself to any future scenario, staying close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, but not so close that she cannot step back if the flames shift. As Edward's cough deepens and his strength wanes, the three Tudor children are like pieces on a board being arranged by unseen hands. And though none of them can see the whole pattern yet, they all know that when the king finally draws his last breath, the silence that follows will be broken not by mourning but by the sound of feet running, horses saddled, ink drying on proclamations, because the struggle for the crown, for the soul of England, and for their own survival is about to move out of whispers and into the open air. When the end finally comes for Edward, it does not look like the thunderclap death of a warrior king on a battlefield. It looks like a boy wasting away in a bed. He is too weak to leave, his thin hands still trying to clutch at the reins of a kingdom that is already starting to pull away from him. The air in the palace grows sour with frightened hope and whispered prayers. Courtiers walking on tiptoe through corridors, heavy with the smell of medicines and failure, while in a chamber, barred to most of the world, the last Tudor son lies listening to his own ragged breath, and thinking not about his sisters' faces, but about the pages on which he has tried to rewrite destiny. Outside, the final version of his device for the succession is being copied in careful hands. The ink drying on a plan that pretends Mary and Elizabeth have never been born. A plan that takes the crown that should fall naturally down the line from father to son to daughter, and shunts it sideways to Lady Jane Grey. That pale, brilliant cousin, whose only crime is that she is useful to the men who gathered around the dying king's bed. News travels strangely in those days. Too fast in some directions and too slowly in others. Mary is not at court when the boy she once held in her arms as a baby draws his last breath. She is on her own lands in East Anglia, the part of the country where her name still has the warm glow of her mother's memory, and where many speak of her as their rightful lady. Someone loyal reaches her ahead of the official messengers. A man who rides his horse to the point of collapse to pour into her ears the truth the council is trying to hide, that Edward is dead, that the men around him mean to keep that news sealed long enough to put someone else on the throne in her place. It is a moment that could have broken her completely, because grief and betrayal arrive in the same sentence. But instead of collapsing, she straightens. All those years of humiliation and forced submission hardening into a single, razor-edged resolve. Mary knows now that every delay could be fatal, that if she obeys the summons to come quietly to court, she may find herself locked away as a troublesome relic, while another woman is crowned with the crown she was born to wear. So she does the most dangerous thing a Tudor woman can do in a kingdom that calls her sex weak, she refuses to obey. Mounts her horse and rides in the opposite direction. The ride into East Anglia becomes a kind of pilgrimage for her. Not toward a holy shrine, but toward her own claim. She rides through villages where people remember Catherine of Aragon's charity and Mary's childhood visits. And wherever she stops, she calls men to her side. Not as a frightened fugitive, but as a queen in all but name. From manor houses and market towns, the gentry come. Some out of conviction, some out of calculation, but all aware that they are at a crossroads that will shape not only their souls, but their properties and their children's futures. Mary speaks to them, not in the cautious phrases of a supplicant, but in the ringing language of legitimacy and faith. She tells them that she is Henry VIII's eldest lawful child, that Parliament itself once acknowledged it, that Edward's last-minute alterations cannot erase the blood in her veins, and that if they follow her, they are following not a rebel, but the rightful heir. She does not hide her religion. She does not whisper that she will compromise later. She tells them plainly that she means to restore the old faith. And somehow, in that hot summer of fear, it is that very certainty that draws people to her. Because in a world where oaths and laws have been rewritten so often, there is something strangely attractive about a woman who will not bend. Meanwhile, in London, the stage is being set for a very different kind of drama. The council, led by the Duke of Northumberland, keeps Edward's death secret for as long as they dare. And then, with a mixture of ceremony and nervous haste, they proclaim Jane Grey Queen. Jane herself is almost as much a prisoner as a monarch in that moment. A thin, scholarly girl who loved her books more than jewels, now dressed in royal magnificence and handed a title she did not ask for. A title that sits on her shoulders like a coat, 2 sizes too big. The proclamation is made at the gates of the city. Trumpets sound. Heralds shout her name. And yet something is wrong. Something palpably wrong. Because instead of the waves of cheering that usually greet the announcement of a new sovereign, a strange, heavy silence falls over the crowd. People look at one another, calculating, skeptical, remembering that just beyond the walls of the city there is another woman whose claim is older and clearer and whose name they have known all their lives. That silence is the first crack in Northumberland's perfect plan, and through it, Mary's rising support begins to seep, as Mary gathers her forces in the east, writing letters that proclaim her accession and calling on towns to declare for her. Northumberland realizes that he will have to do more than shuffle papers and swear oaths if he wants to hold his prize. He marches out of London with troops to cut her off, leaving the Privy Council behind in the capital with Jane, trusting that his hold over both will be enough to keep them obedient. But the moment his back is turned, the winds change. Messages arrive from across the country that men are flocking to Mary's banner, that nobles who had been cautious are now openly calling her queen. And in the council chamber, the same men who signed Jane's proclamation begin to ask themselves whether they are willing to risk their necks for a plan that is collapsing in real time. It happens almost faster than rumour can keep up with 1 hour. They are Jane's ministers. The next they are slipping out of the tower, reassembling in the city, and drafting letters to Mary, in which they address her as their rightful sovereign and beg her pardon for their hesitation. Jane, left in the tower, learns that the crown she never wanted has evaporated in 9 days, and instead of a throne she will have a scaffold, but that, in Mary's story, is a shadow on the edge rather than the main event. Because what matters most in these feverish days is that the people and the power brokers of England have made a choice. Mary's march to London is not the triumphant progress of a queen whose rule is undisputed. It is a charged, dangerous pilgrimage through a country that could still turn on her if God or fortune shifted one more time. Yet with every mile, The fear thickening in her stomach is matched by the growing roar of welcome in the villages and towns she passes. When at last she nears the capital, the city that once watched her mother pushed aside and that looked away while she herself was demoted and humiliated, London puts on a different face. Streets are scrubbed, tapestries hung from windows, branches laid down in the path of her horse, and crowds line the way, eager to see this woman who has defied a council, rallied an army, and snatched the crown out of a carefully laid trap. By her side, riding with calculated grace, is Elizabeth, tall and slender in Tudor colours, her very presence a masterstroke, because it tells the watching world that the Tudor sisters, who have so often been used against each other, are now presenting a united front, at least for the cameras of their day. The watching eyes and gossiping tongues that will carry images of this entry to every corner of the realm. For Mary, that ride must feel like walking into both a dream and a nightmare. The city that once held her under house arrest, that once refused to let her see her dying mother, now roars her name and calls her queen. And yet she knows that many of the same mouths cheering today once cheered Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour and all the other women who seemed secure until they were not. She is lifted up on a tide of acclamation and yet cannot forget how quickly tides turn. And somewhere in the corner of her vision is always Elizabeth, the half-sister who has chosen to support her now, but who, by simply existing as a Protestant alternative, also represents the future that might replace her. Elizabeth herself rides with her face carefully composed, projecting loyalty and quiet awe. And if her heart beats faster with thoughts of what might come after Mary, she buries them deep beneath layers of charm and deference, because the lesson of the last years has been carved into her survive first, shine later. When Mary reaches the heart of the city and enters the tower, not as a prisoner but as a queen claiming her traditional lodging before coronation, the symbolism is almost overwhelming. The same walls that held Anne Boleyn before her death, that would later hold Elizabeth in terror during Wyatt's rebellion, now receive Henry's eldest daughter as a conquering sovereign, and the cannons that once boomed at the execution of foes now thunder in her honour. In that moment the impossible has happened. In a kingdom that swore women were too weak and too emotional to rule, a woman has seized power, not as a regent, not as a consort, but in her own right, by her own will. The toxic tangle between Henry's children has not yet fully tightened, but its roots are here, in this victory that is also a warning, because the same determination that has brought Mary to the gates of London will soon turn toward the church, the pyres and the sisters' fragile alliance, and the crown they now seem to share in triumph will become a burning circle that one of them must eventually wear alone. From the moment Mary steps into the tower as queen, not as captive, the world seems to turn itself inside out, because the fortress that once symbolized her father's power over her now becomes the waiting room for her own authority, and everyone around her scrambles to adjust their faces and their loyalties to this new, unexpected reality. Inside those stone walls, she prepares for the ritual that will fix her kingship, and that word is chosen carefully, because Mary does not see herself as a half-ruler or a reluctant placeholder until a man appears. She sees herself as a sovereign in the full sense, a woman who holds the same divinely ordained authority as any king before her, and she is determined that the coronation that takes her from claimant to anointed queen will make that message impossible to ignore. She insists on using the old Catholic rites as far as she can, processing through streets thick with incense and banners, taking the oil on her forehead and hands from clergy who still remember the world before Henry smashed the link with Rome. And in Westminster she walks in cloth of gold that glitters like firelight. A small figure in heavy robes, whose very presence says to the doubters in the benches and galleries that the age of kings does not end just because the body on the throne is a woman's. Those early days of triumph taste almost sweet, because Mary can finally begin to undo what she has always seen as her father's great sin, the tearing of England away from the church that shaped her soul. And she moves with a mixture of caution and hunger, reversing step by step the Protestant innovations of the previous reign without, at first, dragging the country too violently back into the past. She allows Latin to creep back into the liturgy, invites exiled Catholic clergy home, reopens channels to Rome. And in the beginning there are many who welcome the familiar rhythms, not necessarily from zeal but from the comfort of old habit. At court she restores some of the rituals Catherine of Aragon loved, and in this there is a deep private satisfaction, a sense almost of reaching back through time to comfort the mother who died alone, as if every mass she hears in a royal chapel is a kind of apology written to Catherine's shade. Yet even as she moves, she knows the clock is ticking against her, because she is no girl. She is a woman in her later 30s, and without a child of her own. All her changes risk being washed away with her, just as Edward's Protestant fervour nearly vanished in the moment his heart stopped. So the question of marriage, which had been a distant rumble for so many years, now crashes into the centre of her reign like a storm. Every advisor has an opinion, most of them coloured more by fear than by affection. They warn that if she marries an English nobleman, she will elevate him above all his peers and plunge the realm into jealous factions. But if she marries a foreign prince, she risks seeing England swallowed by his interests, its independence thinned out under the pressure of alliances and wars, not of its own making. Mary listens, but inside, she has already formed a picture drawn from childhood stories of her parents' match, and from her dream of binding her kingdom back into the great Catholic family of Europe. Her eyes turn to Spain, to her cousin Philip, heir to a dynasty that stretches across continents, a man known for his piety and his seriousness, a man whose bloodline connects back to her beloved grandmother, Isabella. In him she sees not only a husband, but a partner in the holy project of restoring the old faith. And perhaps, if God is merciful, the father of the child who will secure that restoration forever. The announcement of her choice falls like a thunderbolt, not only in London but in every shire and parish. Because to many English ears, the name of Spain does not sound like salvation, but like danger. Memories of war with that great Catholic power and dread of foreign dominance flare up, and Protestant exiles and preachers fan those embers into open fear, painting visions of an England turned into a mere province of a vast Spanish empire, its laws bent by an absentee king who does not even speak its language. The council negotiates a treaty that tries to soothe those fears, spelling out limitations on Philip's authority, promising that he shall not drag the country into wars or strip it of offices and treasure. But words on parchment cannot quiet the deeper anxiety that comes from centuries of island pride. In taverns and kitchens, whispers start to coagulate into plots. And somewhere in the midst of this rising unease, a name reshapes itself into a banner. Elizabeth. Mary is not naive. She knows her sister's existence is both an asset and a threat, a living symbol of Tudor continuity, and a potential rival around whom discontent can gather like crows on a roof. At first, she tries to use Elizabeth as a sign of unity, keeping her visible at court, granting her honours that remind everyone that the royal bloodline is not yet thin. But as talk of a Spanish marriage intensifies and Protestant alarm sharpens, Elizabeth's very popularity begins to look less like an ornament and more like a loaded weapon left on a table. The match with Philip goes ahead anyway. He arrives in Southampton in solemn splendour, and the wedding in the summer of the year 1554 turns Winchester into a dream of Catholic triumph. Latin chanted under soaring vaults, Two monarchs, standing beneath canopies of cloth of gold. In Mary's heart, this should be the moment when the years of shame and loneliness are finally washed away, when she stands not as a besieged woman holding a crown with both hands, but as the first half of a royal couple, strong enough to impose their will on a wavering kingdom. Yet even as the bells ring, the rebellion that will put Elizabeth's life in Mary's trembling hands is already coiling itself in the shadows. Sir Thomas Wyatt and other disaffected gentlemen, furious at the thought of a Spanish consort and the tightening Catholic grip, begin to gather forces under the flag of protecting England's liberties and, though not always spoken aloud, under the idea of placing Elizabeth in Mary's stead. The conspirators seem to count on the same things that once carried Mary herself to victory: local loyalties, distrust of foreign interference, the charisma of a Tudor name. And as word of their plans spreads, the capital grows jittery. The uprising that follows is messy, faltering in some counties and surging in others. But for a moment it looks as if the city itself might crack, as if armed men might fight their way across London Bridge to drag Mary from her palace. And in that moment, she shows again the iron core that carried her through Edward's device and Jane's 9 days. She goes before the people of London and the soldiers who must defend her, likely expecting to see doubt and resentment in their faces. And instead she gives them not a timid plea, but a speech that will echo down the centuries, reminding them that though she is a woman, she has the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, staking her safety on their sense of honour and their fear of chaos. It works. The city holds for her. The gates do not open to Wyatt, and his forces stall and crumble under the pressure of loyal troops and dwindling supplies. The rebellion is crushed, Wyatt himself captured and dragged to the block, and the grisly theatre of his execution is meant to write a simple lesson in blood. This queen is not to be pushed aside as easily as her father pushed aside wives. And those who think they can play games with her throne will find their heads separated from their ambitions. But rebellion always leaves a poisonous vapour in the air, a mist of suspicion that seeps into every corner. And at the centre of it stands Elizabeth, who has been drawn toward the plot, whether she wished it or not, who has received letters and approaches from men urging her to be ready to take her place as the Protestant hope if Mary falls. How much she truly knew, how deeply she consented, will never be fully clear. But to Mary, whose trust has been broken too many times, it feels simple. Danger has approached in the shape of her sister yet again. Elizabeth is arrested, taken through the Traitor's Gate into the Tower, into the same lodgings where Anne Boleyn once waited for the sword. And for the younger woman, the echo must be unbearable. The press of old stone walls whispering that Tudor daughters do not always walk back out of these rooms alive. She writes to Mary, protesting her innocence, calling God to witness that she never meant harm. She paces the floors, listens to the footsteps outside, and knows that somewhere in the palace above, men are arguing about whether her neck should be yielded to the axe. Mary's counsellor, anxious to prove their zeal, draw up the warrant. That would end the story of Henry's second daughter right there, in a neat symmetry of blood, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, dying in the same fortress where her mother fell, and they put it before their queen to sign. This is the tightest knot in the toxic bond between the sisters, the moment when Mary holds not just Elizabeth's fate, but the shape of England's future in the trembling fingers that once prayed beside Catherine's bed. To sign would be to remove the most plausible Protestant heir, to secure the Catholic succession in theory, but it would also be to step fully into the role her enemies have already written for her, the role of a shrill, vindictive tyrant, willing to butcher her own blood to protect her vision. The pen hovers. Later stories say her hand shook, that her conscience, or her exhaustion, or some lingering thread of family feeling pulled her back from the brink. And whatever the exact truth, the result is this: the marks of her name do not fall on that paper. Elizabeth is not executed. She is held, questioned, watched, but she is allowed, eventually, to leave the tower alive. In sparing her sister, Mary believes she is acting with a measure of mercy, perhaps even of prudence. But in that act, she also unwittingly writes the next chapter of her own eclipse, because the very woman she cannot quite bring herself to destroy will soon stand in the place she is fighting so hard to fortify. For now, however, the balance between them is still tilted. Mary wears the crown. Mary has a husband. Mary commands the council and the courts. And Mary believes, with the unshaken faith born in childhood chapels, that if she burns away heresy and bears a child, she can yet remake England into the Catholic kingdom she dreamed of in her youth. The fires have not yet roared to their full height. The phantom swelling in her belly has not yet humiliated her before Europe. But the path toward those bitter trials is already laid. And Elizabeth, released from her tower, but still moving carefully in her sister's shadow, has learned the sharpest lesson of all. That survival in this family depends not on being loved, but on being necessary to someone's idea of the future. The first flames begin almost quietly, like a rumor you can smell before you see it. Thin columns of smoke threading up from market squares where people have always gathered to gossip and bargain, now turned into theatres of fear. Mary, who has spent her entire life believing that truth is something you kneel for, not something you debate, signs the warrants for heresy with a hand that does not tremble. Because in her mind, this is not cruelty. It is surgery. She imagines herself as a physician cutting out infection before it spreads. And in the dim chambers where she consults with her bishops, she hears again the arguments of her childhood. The sermons that taught her that to let a heretic live is to share his guilt. The men who come before the courts under her watch are not faceless to their neighbours. They are weavers and preachers and aging scholars. Some stubborn, some frightened, some heartbreakingly young. But in the machinery of law, they become examples, warnings. Fuel. When the first stakes are driven into the ground and the first piles of wood stacked high, there is still time for the country to step back from the horror. Mary herself imagines that a few stern lessons will be enough. That once the crowd has seen what happens to those who defy the restored church, obedience will settle softly again like dust after a storm. But fire is a terrible teacher, and it does not teach the lessons she thinks it will. People come to the burnings at first out of curiosity, or because the law expects their presence, or because they have been told that watching the destruction of heresy will strengthen their faith, and they crowd around the ropes that hold them back, jostling for a view as if waiting for a play. What they get instead are the sounds and smells that will cling to their sleep for years, the screams of men and women who refuse, even with flames licking their legs, to recant what they believe, the sickening scent of charred flesh, the sight of someone singing a psalm as skin blisters and blackens. In those moments, the neat lines Mary's bishops have drawn between truth and error blur for the people leaning forward in the smoke. They see not abstract sin but human endurance. And the fires that are supposed to cleanse England's soul begin to scorch Mary's reputation instead. In the counting houses and alehouses later, when tongues loosen over ale, people whisper the number of those burned, dozens becoming 100, 100 becoming almost 300 by the time her reign is done, and the phrase that later ages will brand her with Bloody Mary is born not in the Latin of proclamations, but in the nervous jokes and horrified stories of people who stood too close to the heat. Inside the palace, Mary does not smell the smoke. At least not at first. What she feels instead is a kind of grim relief, a sense that at last the country is being brought back into line with the pattern God intended, each burning a mark on a great internal ledger where souls and sins are counted. The restoration of Catholic ritual seems, for a while, to be working. Altars are rebuilt, images return to niches, processions once again wind through streets under fluttering banners, and the papal legate stands once more on English soil to pronounce absolution on a realm that broke away in her father's fury. In quieter hours, when she kneels before the sacrament she was once forbidden to hear in her own household, Mary feels almost as if time has bent back on itself, as if she has brought England home to the chapel of her childhood. And in those moments, the lonely girl who begged in vain to see her dying mother seems to find a kind of posthumous vindication. Yet even in the glow of candles, there is a deeper want that will not be satisfied by ritual alone. A want that wakes her in the night with a hand pressed to her own abdomen, because she knows that without a child, a living Catholic heir, every mass she has restored might vanish again when she does. So when her body begins to change, when her gowns need letting out and her cycles stop, the hope that surges through her is like a second coronation. Courtiers start to speak in low, careful voices about signs of pregnancy, about a swelling that must surely mean the long-prayed-for heir is finally forming in the safety of her womb. And across the country, church bells are prepared. Tudor's planned. Letters drafted to send abroad, announcing the miracle that God has bestowed on his faithful daughter. Philip, who has been dutiful and distant, suddenly has a reason to linger, and for a brief season, Mary can believe that everything she has suffered has led to this, that the humiliations of her youth, the tears and the lonely meals, and the documents she signed under duress, have all been stepping stones toward a glorious future in which a strong Catholic son will rule a reconciled England at her side. She summons Elizabeth to court, not now as a potential rival, but as a witness to the child who will push her permanently into the second rank. And for Elizabeth, the summons must taste like ashes, because she knows that if Mary truly gives birth to a healthy heir, her own long, cautious march towards survival may end in a polite, permanent oblivion. The months pass, and the court holds its breath. The Queen withdraws more and more into a cocoon of waiting. Curtains drawn, physicians counting days, and listening to her stomach with the confidence of men who want to please their sovereign. And outside her chamber door, the whole of Europe leans closer in curiosity. But with each week beyond the expected term, the murmurs grow louder. Servants who once smiled broadly as they carried trays into Mary's rooms begin to glance sideways at her figure, noticing that it has not changed as a heavily pregnant woman's should, and rumours slip down the back stairs and out into the streets that something is wrong, that perhaps there is no baby, that perhaps this swelling is not the sign of life, but the mask of disease. Mary, who has built her entire sense of self on endurance, responds as she always has, by clinging harder to faith, telling herself that Sarah and Elizabeth in Scripture conceived late, that God might be testing her patience again, that the humiliation she suffered in her father's house will not be repeated in her own hall. And then the day comes when she can no longer pretend, when even she, who once waited 10 bitter years for a papal decision that never came, has to face the fact that the child whose name she has whispered in prayer does not exist. There is no blood, no tiny corpse to mourn, nothing tangible to bury. There is only the absence where hope had been, and the weight of other people's eyes. She has to step out of her guarded rooms and back into public life with her belly receding and her cradle empty, knowing that every courtier who bows is also measuring what has been lost. that ambassadors will write home in careful phrases about a phantom pregnancy, that enemies will snicker that God has mocked her. Philip, already restless in a land that does not love him, reads the writing in the air and turns his attention back to the sprawling Habsburg world, leaving England and his wife behind for long stretches of time that make it painfully clear where his heart truly lies. For Mary, this double abandonment, by the imagined child and the all-too-real husband, is like reopening the wound. Her father left when he banished her from Catherine's side. She had thought that by marrying Philip, by binding herself to Spain, she might finally escape the loneliness that has shadowed her since adolescence. The sense of being always half-exiled even in her own country. And instead, she finds herself once more the woman left behind, clutching letters, watching doors that do not open, listening to counselors explain why the king cannot return just now. Her health, never robust, falters under the strain. The old stomach pains gnaw at her. Headaches send her reeling, and waves of black despair roll over her in the early hours when even prayer feels thin. Yet she will not step back from the course she has set. If anything, as her body weakens, her policies harden, the fires burn hotter, the penalties for heresy tighten, because she is running now, not just against Protestant doctrine, but against time itself. Elizabeth, watching from the cautious distance Mary allows her, sees all this with a mixture of pity, dread and calculation. She knows better than anyone how deep the grooves of humiliation run in Mary's soul, how every slight and setback seems to confirm the story Mary tells herself, that only absolute obedience to Rome and to the God of her childhood can make the suffering meaningful. At the same time, Elizabeth can feel the wind turning again, can hear, in quiet corridors and country letters, the way people begin to speak of her not just as the king's daughter, but as the likely next queen. Because the country can see what Mary, in her desperation, will not admit that there will be no child, no Catholic heir, no safe continuation of this experiment in female sovereignty tethered to Spanish power. So Elizabeth does what she has always done when danger and opportunity arrive holding hands. She keeps her head bowed just enough to reassure her sister, mouths the required Catholic formulas with as little soul as possible, while keeping her inner beliefs carefully veiled, and waits, silent as a cat in the long grass, as Mary's reign burns itself down toward embers, knowing that when the flames shrink and the smoke clears, everyone will be looking for a figure who can stand in the soot and say, in a different voice, that England has had enough of fire. By the time the phantom child has faded completely from Mary's body, something more serious has begun to fade from the kingdom's patience. Because the people who once lined the streets to shout her name now carry her in their minds as two separate images that will not fuse together. The devout daughter, who stood up to a council and claimed her birthright, and the stern queen whose stubborn faith has filled the air with the smell of smoke and left them tied to a foreign husband who seems to love their coin and soldiers more than their queen. Philip's long absences turn from an awkward diplomatic fact into a symbol that everybody understands. They see the ships that take him away, the dust that fills the empty space where his court should be, and the letters that arrive thick with requests for money and troops to fight his continental wars. While Mary remains in London trying to convince herself that these demands are simply the natural duties of an allied kingdom, she clings to the idea that her marriage is not only a private sacrament but a bridge pulling England back into the grand Catholic alliance. Yet with each year, the bridge looks less like a graceful arch and more like a tilted plank leading into someone else's fire. The final blow to her prestige does not come from a sermon or a burning, but from a map, from the brutal erasure of a little patch of English red on the French coast that has been held for generations and cherished as a foothold on the continent. Gaulice, that salty fragment of conquered France, is more than a port. It is a symbol of victories past, of the days when English kings marched across the Channel and thought of themselves as lords of lands on both sides of the water. And when news reaches London that this last scrap has fallen, that French banners flutter on its walls and English garrisons have been swept away, Mary feels the loss like a physical wound. People later will say, perhaps apocryphally, but with a cruel aptness, that when she dies, the name of Calais will be found engraved on her heart. Because to her it is proof that the war she entered at Philip's urging has given her nothing but grief to her subjects. It is yet another confirmation that the Spanish marriage has yoked them to causes that bleed them while offering no real gain. The old pride that once flared when they thought of their island nation now flickers uneasily. And in that flicker, Elizabeth's outline grows sharper, as Mary's body weakens. The court begins to tilt as predictably as a plant, bending toward the strongest light. Courtiers who once wrapped themselves in Spanish fashions and murmured about their queen's godly zeal begin to make careful visits to Hatfield, to the quieter household where Elizabeth has been living under a watchful, controlled sort of liberty. And those visits are gestures written in a language everyone understands too well. They bring flattering letters, small gifts, cautious conversations in which they say nothing treasonous and everything suggestive. And Elizabeth, who long ago learned to hide her true reactions beneath a surface of grace, receives them with a mixture of warmth and unbreakable vagueness, promising nothing concrete, and yet sending each visitor away with the feeling that they have invested early in a future that is now all but inevitable. Even Mary can see what is happening. Because she is not blind and she is not a fool, her judgment may be warped by pain and devotion. But she understands the way power flows. And she knows that when people begin to drift away from a reigning monarch toward a waiting heir, it is as much an act of self-preservation as it is of betrayal. In her more lucid moments, she tries to hold on to the reins of this story, to write the ending in lines that will comfort her own conscience. She insists that Elizabeth swear, again and again, that she will uphold the old religion, that she will keep England Catholic, that she will not undo the reconciliation with Rome that has cost so much in blood and humiliation. Elizabeth responds with the only weapon she truly has, an artful, almost musical ambiguity, crafting phrases that sound like obedience, without nailing her to any solemn vow she cannot later slip around. She speaks of preserving true religion without saying which form of it. She praises God's mercy without mentioning Rome. She assures Mary of her filial love and loyalty in tones that could be offered to any dying relative. And Mary, exhausted and racked with sickness, chooses to take these words at their most comforting value, because the alternative, to believe that all she has done, will be swept away by the sister she spared, is too bitter to contemplate in the hours when she can hardly climb the stairs without assistance. Illness shrinks her world by degrees. Where once she rode out in processions and presided over council debates with a sharp, if narrow, mind, she now spends more and more time in chambers thick with the smells of herbs and candle wax, attended by physicians whose treatments drain her as much as her disease. Her skin, always pale, takes on a sallow cast, and her eyes, which once flashed with that unmistakable Tudor temper, now look out over a world that seems to be pulling away from her, one quiet inch at a time. Reports come in from the shires that some parishes still resist her restored Mass, that people slip away from Latin services to listen to English psalms in homes and barns, that the fires meant to burn heresy out of the land have instead hardened the resolve of those who survive to remember them. She pushes for more, for stronger enforcement, for sternness at the border between orthodoxy and error. But even she can feel that her commands fall with less weight than they once did, that men nod in her presence and then go away to calculate how many months or years they must keep obeying a queen whose cough worsens with every passing season. Somewhere in the web of those years, there may have been a last, private moment between the sisters that no chronicler fully captured. A moment when Mary, propped up on cushions, reached out to take Elizabeth's hand and saw in that younger face not just a rival creed but the echo of their father's eyes, the shared griefs that have deformed them both. Perhaps she spoke softly then about duty, about what it means to hold a crown in a world that doubts a woman's right to wear it, about the loneliness of decision and the way male counselors always think they know better even when their advice has led to disaster. And perhaps Elizabeth, moved in spite of herself, answered in more than polite platitudes, acknowledging that it is Mary who has had to hack the path through the thorns so that she might later walk a little more easily. Whether or not such a scene unfolded in quite that way, the truth underneath it remains when Mary's body finally gives out in the late autumn of the year 1558. England is more ready than it has ever been to accept the idea of a queen in her own right, because it has already seen one sit on the throne and endure. Her death itself is quiet, a slipping away rather than an explosion, and when the news spills out of the palace, it does so accompanied by the second piece of information that matters even more, that Elizabeth has been proclaimed queen without a struggle, without a rival army on the march, without a flurry of contested documents and desperate rides through the countryside. After the storms and plots and improvised coups that marked the deaths of Henry and Edward, this transition feels almost uncanny in its smoothness, as if the kingdom has at last grown tired of tearing itself open every time a monarch dies. Elizabeth receives the news with outward humility, falling to her knees under an oak in the countryside, thanking God in words that witnesses will repeat with reverence. Yet behind the scene lies the long line of choices, evasions and survivals that brought her to this exact point. Alive, unburned, unforgotten, precisely when the country is desperate for a sovereign who is neither an old flamethrower nor a foreign prince. As she makes her way toward London, the city that will now shape itself around her for decades to come, Elizabeth moves through a landscape still marked by Mary's reign. Past churches where the smell of incense lingers in the stone. Past marketplaces where people remember watching neighbours burn. Past harbours where sailors cursed the loss of Calais and the wars it symbolised. She carries with her memories not only of her own jeopardy, but of Mary's speeches, Mary's coronation, Mary's stubborn insistence that a woman could wield royal authority without dissolving into hysteria or vanishing behind a husband's shadow, without her sister's painful example. Elizabeth's own experiment in unmarried, image-drenched rule might have seemed too shocking to accept. The toxic relationship between them has left scars on both their stories, but it has also carved a new shape into the English imagination. A shape in which queens are no longer just consorts or regents, but the point where power rests. Mary's body will be carried to Westminster and laid eventually in a tomb that she does not keep to herself later. When Elizabeth has reigned and died, that same stone structure will be opened to receive the second sister, the second queen, and their bones will lie together in uneasy companionship under a single monument. On the surface, the inscription will celebrate Elizabeth, the long reigning, the victorious, the Virgin Queen whose name attaches itself to a golden age. But beneath that carved flattery, the two skulls rest in the same darkness, equal in death in a way they never quite were in life. As Elizabeth's reign unfolds, with all its brightness and brutality, the ghost of Mary will be there in every decision to burn or forgive. In every argument over how harshly to enforce religious uniformity, in every tremor of fear that nudges the Queen away from marriage and toward the safer embrace of symbolism and spectacle. The story of England's two great Tudor sisters does not end with one replacing the other. It stretches on in the habits of a country that will. From this point onward, I find it easier to imagine a woman at the center of its history, precisely because it has already watched two of them bleed for that, right? Elizabeth walks into London, not as a blank page, but as a woman whose whole body is written over with other people's mistakes. And from the moment she feels the crown's weight pressing down on her hair, she understands that her reign will be judged in constant comparison to the burning sister who came before her, and the roaring father who smashed the world beneath them both. She has watched Mary try to drag time backwards with fire and treaties. She has watched Edward's counsellors try to drag it forwards with proclamations and paper. She has watched Henry tear the kingdom in half, just to get a son who died before his beard had grown. And she has survived all of this, not by charging straight at danger, but by learning to bend around it, to duck under it, to let it tire itself out, while she remains standing. So when she speaks to the city in those first days, when she lets the people see the red hair that reminds them of her father, and the clever eyes that once watched silently from the shadows, she does not promise to burn every heretic, or to march under the Pope's banner, or to remake everything from the altar up. She promises uncertainty and balance wrapped in the language of peace. Something so novel after years of absolutist zeal that the country hardly knows whether to trust it or to cling to it like a life raft. The religious settlement she shapes in the first years of her reign is less a grand vision and more a long, careful negotiation with ghosts, especially Mary's. Elizabeth knows that if she swings the pendulum too violently away from the old faith, if she makes martyrs at the speed her sister did, she will not be remembered as Gloriana, but as another fanatic in a different costume. Yet she also knows that she cannot, will not, live in a kingdom chained to Rome, not after everything her father wrecked to break that chain. So she crafts something in between, a church that speaks English at the altar, but still looks enough like the old one to comfort nervous souls. A liturgy that can be interpreted by a devout Protestant as a sermon and by a cautious conservative as a sacrament. And she enforces it with a hand that is firm, but not yet dripping. The fines and laws are real, and those who refuse entirely to conform will feel the bite of prison, and worse. But she is careful about how often she spills blood, in part because she knows how vividly the memory of Mary's fires still glows in the minds of people who stood in those crowds, and in part because she has no desire to see her own name paired with the word bloody on the lips of future generations. Where Mary believed that a queen proves her love of God by how many heretics she can drive to the stake, Elizabeth decides, whether consciously or instinctively, that she will prove hers by how long she can keep the kingdom from tearing itself apart over doctrine again. Yet the toxic bond with Mary does not loosen just because one of them lies in stone and the other sits on a throne. In council discussions, Elizabeth will sometimes speak of her sister with an abrupt, almost defensive respect, reminding the men before her that Mary was the first woman to force Parliament and people to accept a queen regnant, that she passed laws which declare that a woman wearing the crown has the same authority as any man. And in quieter, unrecorded moments she may remember Mary's small figure in that purple gown riding into London while Elizabeth rode behind her. Faces turned toward crowds, hungry for stability. At the same time, she allows, even encourages, the stories that paint Mary as the failure against which Elizabeth shines, the gloomy, blood-soaked prequel to her own bright play. Pamphlets and chronicles talk about deliverance from Spanish domination, from papists, from stakes, and they whisper that God has replaced a barren, weeping queen with one who smiles and dances and laughs and manages somehow to remain unattached to any man's demands. It is a clever piece of image work, but it rests on the spine of Mary's pain, because every time Elizabeth is praised as the saviour who brought the country out of darkness, That darkness is her sister's face. The idea of remaining unmarried, which Mary could not have imagined as anything but a failure, becomes Elizabeth's sharpest tool, and here again the shadow of their relationship lies under every choice. Elizabeth has seen what marriage did to her sister, how that alliance with Spain twisted popular love into suspicion, how Philip's neglect and the humiliations of the false pregnancy hollowed Mary out from within. And she has not forgotten her own younger self in Catherine Parr's house, learning in the worst possible way how dangerous it is to trust herself to a man's protection. So she takes the story that might have been told about her as a woman unchosen, unloved, incomplete, and rewrites it into a performance in which she marries the country instead, slips the wedding ring of sovereignty onto her own finger, and declares herself wed to England. Suitors come from every corner of Europe, princes and archdukes, and each time she pleads the necessity of politics or hints that she might yet change her mind, stretching out the bargaining like a cat playing with string. But at the core of all this, flirtation is a solid refusal to surrender her body or her legal authority to anyone who could make her another Mary, trapped between her own conscience and her husband's wars. As years lengthen into decades, the veneer of golden age thickens around her reign. There is a surge in printed words, in plays and poems, in songs and pamphlets. The language of the country itself seems to crackle and expand, and Elizabeth's own image is folded into all this creativity, painted and repainted, until she appears more symbol than flesh. A marble-faced virgin queen with a ruff like a halo and jewels like stars. It would be easy, from a distance, to forget the burnt villages in Ireland or the bodies swinging from English gallows. But the kingdom has never been free of violence and never will be. And Elizabeth, no less than Mary, will sign death warrants when she thinks it necessary. As Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and rival, learns when her head falls in a distant castle at Fotheringhay. Yet even that most intimate act of royal killing is bound up in the shared story of the sisters, because Mary Stuart's claim to the English throne was rooted in the same logic of legitimacy and Catholic inheritance that once carried Mary Tudor to London. And when Elizabeth finally agrees to have her executed, she is not simply removing a rival. She is severing one of the last living branches of the mental world in which her own sister had once been nurtured. At the moment of the Spanish Armada, the great crisis that posterity loves to frame as Elizabeth's finest hour, Mary's ghost is there again, haunting the gun decks and the Queen's own words. Spain, which Mary had invited into the marital bed of the kingdom, now sends ships bristling with soldiers and priests to reverse Elizabeth's settlement by force, to put an obedient Catholic puppet on the throne in her place. And the fear that grips England is as much about the return of Mary's world as it is about foreign invasion. When Elizabeth rides to Tilbury and makes her famous declaration about having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, she is speaking into that fear, using the language of masculine courage that both she and Mary were forced to learn to be taken seriously. And behind that speech is the unspoken understanding that if her sister had not already proven that a woman could sit in armor of authority without collapsing, these words might have sounded like farce. Instead, they ring true, in part because another queen once stood before armed men and swore that she would not yield her throne even if she had to die for it. In the later years, as Elizabeth's own body begins to betray her, as teeth loosen and wigs grow heavier, and the face beneath the white paint wrinkles like old parchment, she sometimes retreats into a solitude that looks eerily like Mary's, surrounded by a shrinking circle of trusted servants and haunted by regrets she will not name. She has no child, just as Mary had none, and she has spent so long being the focus of hope and fear that the idea of making way for someone else feels like erasing herself. Yet she cannot doubt that death will come, and with it the question of what she has truly secured. The religious settlement will hold, shakily but sturdily enough that future generations will call the country Protestant by default, and the memory of her glories will cling to the language and the theatres. But the Tudor bloodline will end with her, closing the story begun by Henry and his wives in a final, childless, full stop. When her body is carried to Westminster and their shared tomb is opened, Mary lies waiting in the darkness. The sister, whose name has become a curse in some mouths and a badge of courage in others. And the joining of their remains is the last ironic twist in a relationship that began in cradles and ended in crowns. Under that stone, the labels fall away. No one can tell which bones belong to the woman who lit the fires and which to the woman who learned from them how to rule without quite so much smoke. No one can say which fragments of skull once held the thoughts that broke with Rome and which held the thoughts that refused to return to it. Above them, tourists and mourners and scholars walk past, reading inscriptions that praise Elizabeth and barely mention Mary. And yet the air inside the abbey is full of the consequences of both their lives, full of the simple fact that by the time the current monarch's face looks out from our coins and screens, the idea of a queen is no longer a theological crisis but a familiar rhythm. The toxic relationship between Henry's daughters, the years of exile and suspicion, and almost lethal rivalry, did not end with one killing the other. It ended with both of them having proved, in very different ways, that a woman can bear the crushing weight of a crown and not shatter, that she can be both the wound and the cure at the heart of a nation. And every time the choristers' voices rise up toward the stones above their shared tomb, the sound curls around two sets of nameless bones that once belonged to sisters who loved and failed and feared and fought, and who, for all the fire that passed between them, changed forever what this strange island imagined when it heard the word Queen